Okay, for me, it's right at the top of the hour. And in honor of everyone's time, I'd like us to get started. We have a lot of information to go through, and I want to make sure we have the time to do it. I want to start by welcoming everyone to our webinar on making the most of CEDS. If you don't know me already, my name is Sarah, and I act as the knowledge management lead for CID, as well as a TA provider in a handful of states. As I said, we have a lot of really great information to present to you, so I don't want to take up a lot of information here at the beginning, but we have a fun little icebreaker for you all to participate in the form of a poll. I don't know what the weather's doing where you all live, but here in the Midwest it's starting to really feel like fall finally, and we're getting into pumpkin patch and apple picking mode. So with that in mind, what is your favorite fall flavor, pumpkin or apple? Oh, it looks like Apple's in the lead right now. We'll give it just a little bit more time and then we'll move on. Oh, Pumpkin's catching up. All right. Well, it looks like on this webinar, at least, the majority of people, just slightly, are Apple over Pumpkin people. So thank you for helping us kick off our webinar with just a little bit of fun. Um, so with that, we're going to step into the agenda. Let me pop over here to the agenda. I will, in just a minute, I'll introduce our presenters. We have both CID staff and state staff participating in our webinar today. First, we'll have Rachel give us an overview of data governance and some basic principles and key considerations on the subject. And then she'll touch briefly on CEDS and modernization and what that looks like for states. And then from there, we'll get into the meat of our webinar. We will have a round robin discussion with our state representatives who will be talking about their experience with CEDS and integrated data systems within the state. As we go through the webinar, we will be monitoring the chat. So if you have questions as we go along, please feel free to pop your questions in there and we'll do our best to get you answers or reach out to you in another way. With that, here is our state presenters. Again, my name is Sarah Sinani, and then we have Darren Wright and Rachel Wilkinson presenting today. And from our state staff, we have Charlotte Zeller from Kansas, Deborah Donovan from Mississippi, and Richard Madison from Kansas as well. With that, I am going to turn it over to Rachel so we can get started right into the meat of the webinar.
Thank you, Sarah. Sorry, it helps if you unmute first. Thank you all for joining today. My name is Rachel Wilkinson, and I'm excited to share with you a little bit of an overview regarding data governance. So data governance is a broad topic, but largely we define it as a management of data. So that includes things like data availability, data usability, data quality, and also data security. And this management is really best achieved by creating and enforcing policies or practices, internally establishing roles and responsibilities, and then clearly defining procedures. So we're going to talk today about the 4 key principles of data governance that we've identified as being really important and salient to this work. And those 4 principles are data quality and timeliness, transparency, privacy and security, and then data use and access. Let me see. Sorry, scrolling backwards apparently. So we're going to go to the first principle, and that first one is data quality and timeliness. So when we talk through what this actually means, I'm going to use a little bit of a graphic on these next few slides to walk through some key considerations we keep in mind. So when we think about data quality and timeliness, we know that data are often used when we think about policy decisions or funding decisions. And because of how important those decisions are, it's really essential that we're making these decisions with high quality data that are complete, they're reliable, they're accurate, and they're also current. So here's a quick slide walking through some of these key considerations. And the first consideration I want to talk about is using data systems to capture the information that's necessary to actually guide policy and decision making. And it's important that these data systems are also updated as needed. So an example of a situation where you might want to make updates is maybe the state is using new intervention strategies for students with disabilities in high school. And what you want to see is, well, are these strategies actually leading to improved outcomes or improved graduation rates? In that case, you may have to revisit your data system and say, do we have a way to track these intervention strategies? Do we have a way to link this information to graduation rate? So those are the types of things you'll want to keep in mind as you think about your data systems as they are and as they need to be to support your state staff. And then also the broad array of CEDS elements. And when we say CEDS, for those of you maybe not familiar with the acronym, it's the Common Education Data Standards. So the broad array of CEDS elements that are out there are also really helpful for states to review. They can give you an idea of what other states have identified as key elements for their analysis, for their work in the state. And that can give you some ideas of things you might want to consider. Because it's an open source community, you can add elements that you identify over time. All right, so for our next example, there. We want to establish clear business rules or edit checks that are universally applied. So we want to ensure consistency as well as the accuracy of the data. So one thing that can be helpful when you're preparing business rules is aligning those source elements that you have in your own state data system to CEDS. And this describes sort of the relationship between the two items, which is important when you're thinking about EdFacts reporting and how to transform that data for accurate data submissions. It's also important that our business rules are clearly articulated and they're available to the relevant parties. So you want to make sure that CID resources like this data integration toolkit or the IDEA Part B data submission organizer are available and used to document those business rules, because that can be really, really helpful. And then also creating those business rules helps you for developing ETLs for those of you who might be implementing Generate. So having those business rules in place can really put you ahead of the curve as you begin implementing that tool. And it's important to adjust our business rules. So we know that sometimes mapping data for ETLs can uncover data quality challenges or issues, and that can be frustrating, but it can also be a way to quickly address problems that are being observed. Right. And then for our next item that we're going to go into, it's establishing clear policies and practices to address data quality issues. And so if you're seeing data issues with say certain reports and there's quality concerns, and you follow up with staff that may have submitted the data, maybe it's your local education agencies, and maybe you're asking them to correct their data. It's important to have a process in place where those corrections aren't just being made in a vacuum, like a spreadsheet being updated, but that you're also having a policy or practice in place that says, update the data source, update the source system. So things like that can ensure continuity in the data and consistency if you ever have to retroactively pull information. And then there should be policies and practices in place for data correction that can be documented as well. So if you want to put things like that in your Part B data submission organizer or any other tools or methods you use to document this information, it's good to have a repository that everyone can access so we're all clear. All right, I'm going to go to our fourth principle that or key consideration for this principle. So it's establishing explicit due dates and timelines so that everyone is clear on when things are due, and that creates accountability. It's also important to think about how you as a state might enforce complying with due dates and timelines. Maybe you encourage adding timeliness to your risk rubrics for monitoring, or incorporate timeliness into things like your LEA determinations. And the Part B data submission organizer can also help with understanding and establishing these timelines and these due dates. This tool is great. It has a tab that gives you sort of an overarching landscape of everything that's due across the year. So it's an annual calendar, but it also has individual tabs for each data collection where you can actually document due dates and timelines, which can be really helpful. And I want to highlight the communication is also key for ensuring that timelines are met and due dates are met. People need to be aware of when things are due so that they can submit high quality data in a timely fashion. Finally, I want to go to our last consideration, which is ensuring that data are relevant by providing reports are accessible. So if you're putting together data displays or charts or graphs, is that information accessible to diverse audiences? Because we know that the more eyes we get on data, the more information we get from stakeholders, and the more we can identify data quality challenges. And reports can be run in the Generate tool that can give you this information. You can see where your data currently stand. So that's a great way to really achieve this consideration of getting accessible information quickly. And then I wanted to just highlight on this slide some of the resources. We obviously don't have time to go into all of them today, but we are going to post this slide deck as well as a recording of this presentation on the CED website. So you will be able to access these links. These are just really useful things to think about when you consider how you can support data quality and timeliness. So next, we're going to go to the principle of transparency. We know that it's best practice to be transparent about our business rules, and then it's also important to be transparent when we're communicating information about things like student progress or student outcomes. And the importance of transparency is really highlighted within IDEA and ESEA or ESSA now, because there are so many public reporting requirements outlined in those regulations. So our key considerations that we want to think about for this, this principle are first to think about trainings and manuals for data system users. So the first thing to consider is, are you inputting data accurately? Are people able to understand the details about the fields that they're entering data for? Things like trainings and manuals can really achieve this. And then also for those reviewing data, do they know what reports they might be able to access and retrieve to learn more about the fields that are being collected in their data systems? Next, we'll think about the public availability of business rules. So it's also important for that information to be available publicly. States may not be able to share all of their business rules down to the level of detail that maybe they need to have internally. But it's also important to have as much information as you can available to stakeholders. So say you want to communicate how graduation rates are calculated. Having those business rules for calculating graduation rate can be really helpful, so that that's publicly available for people to access and they understand the implications of those data and how the information was collected. Right. Go to our next item, which is ensuring that publicly available data are accessible. So again, this is going back to that other consideration I had mentioned. The more people that can access information publicly, the more we can get diverse feedback and business rules. Sorry. Right. And these are some of the resources that we've identified for supporting this principle of transparency. And again, these will all be available in our slide deck online. And the third principle I'm going to go into is privacy and security. So one thing we want to highlight is that IDEA data are protected under IDEA and FERPA, and in some instances, actually HIPAA as well. And because of this, it's really important that there are clear policies and procedures in place to ensure that student confidentiality is maintained when reporting and using data. So here are some key principles we want to focus on as well for this considerations. So what we think about is we want to ensure that documented processes are in place to certify the data are confidential. So if new data elements are added to the system, are there mechanisms in place to actually verify that these new data are going to be protected and secure and won't compromise confidentiality of other data? Are there different verifications the state will perform to actually ensure that security features for the data system are working as expected? Right. And then, as I noted, we also want to ensure that we are adhering to the FERPA and HIPAA requirements. So we want to ensure that people are attesting that they're going to be compliant with confidentiality documents. So are they signing any form attesting to, sorry, I'm just getting some messages through here, attesting to this information so that they are adhering to the security and confidentiality requirements. And then finally, addressing suppression rules. So if there are small populations, is there a way the state is ensuring that those counts that are small that could compromise student confidentiality are actually being applied consistently? So the documented suppression rules are really helpful if there's staff turnover, because that establishes sustainability, clear documentation of why data should be suppressed and for what reports. And again, here are some of the resources to consider for that. And I'm going to go to our fourth principle of data governance, which is data use and access. So this principle considers how data are being used by an organization and if it's aligned with the organization's goals, and really walking that line between privacy but also transparency, which is a fine line to walk. One thing that's really important is to have agreements in place to ensure that when data are being accessed and used, the data are based on these established policies. So some of these considerations, first, we want to think about having clear processes for requesting and granting user access. So are users getting access to what they need versus maybe what they want? Because we know sometimes that can be challenging. So documenting how access is provided is really important for consistency across the state and also for data security. And then keeping clear documentation on users with access to the system. So if a user leaves the agency in which they have access to a data system, are you ensuring that there are mechanisms in place to deactivate that user's account? Or are there logs of users' access to the system? If someone hasn't logged in for several years, is there a necessity for them to continue to have access? So those are important things to consider. The second thing is establishing user permissions and user types to ensure that users are getting access that's pertinent to their role. As I noted before, sometimes people want to see data, but it may not be data that they actually need to see. And then finally, establishing data request systems or mechanisms that actually outline how people can request information. So if data are confidential, then there need to be legal agreements in place, things like memorandums of understanding or MOUs that can really help protect all the parties involved. And then here are some resources related to this principle of data use and access. I'm going to skip through those quickly in the interest of time. And this is just a slide with some additional resources of where we retrieve some of this information from regarding the principles of data governance. So you can access those as well if you want to log on to the slides later. All right. And I'm going to stop here for a moment to make sure, is everyone able to hear me? I know there might have been some issues with me lagging or my video being off. Yes.
I think you're all set, Rachel.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So the last thing I want to highlight here is CEDS and modernization. So one of the questions we've heard is, how does leveraging CEDS and Generate actually support modernization? For those of you who may not be familiar, there is a shift currently going on to where we are going to, instead of getting data quality reports after submitting 618 files, like say exiting or personnel or discipline, which are coming up in just a month or so. Instead of completing those data quality reviews from the January to May timeline, it will be conducting those data quality reviews on the front end prior to submitting files, which is really important. And CEDS and Generate can be really helpful as you consider how you're going to prepare for this change. So we know that using CEDS and Generate, it requires quality documentation, which is going to be super important when you think about how you're going to document your processes for this shift in timelines. And the process of moving data from those custom data elements in your own systems to the CEDS elements to ensure quality of EDFACS files, it always identifies some nuances or assumptions about the data that can maybe help lead to improved data quality. And because that's the major focus of this EDFACS modernization process, you can see that it would be really important to ensure that all your data are aligning to CEDS elements. And as you implement Generate, that can ensure further success and ease of that implementation to ensure your files are high quality when they're ultimately completed, because that is the goal of modernization. For our second question, what does it mean to participate in CEDS? So CEDS is really leveraged by the state. And as a state as a data standard, it's really a common language across education data. So it's available to those despite where your state is and where you might be across the country. It creates sort of this localized, approachable set of data standards that everyone can use and link their own data to. And as different groups, when talking about different data elements, that might lead to incongruency in communication. So this creates that shared vocabulary, and this can be really helpful for EDFACS reporting when we're all sending, quote unquote, the same data to the Department of Education. It may look a little different based on our own business rules, but we want that data to be consistent, and those CEDS elements help preserve that consistency. So another question we wanted to consider is, if I have Generate, am I actually aligned to CEDS? So CEDS contains elements that are across the education data stratosphere. So that includes preschool all the way to post-secondary and actually workforce data as well. And Generate is actually that kind of physical implementation of the data standard. And so that's just what we use for EDFACS reporting. So if a state is implementing Generate and they've aligned their data elements to CEDS for their EDFACS files, then that can really help ensure the high quality data is being submitted and alignment to CEDS as a user of Generate. And then finally, why would my state want to be active in the open source community? So the CEDS open source community is an amazing place to learn about use and improvements, projects and new elements from a variety of stakeholders who are engaged with CEDS, and that includes other states. And then this community can help give you ideas about information or data elements collaboratively that might be useful for you to consider in your own state agency. And then all the communication and the vocabulary is consistent because we're all using the same language. And then finally, the open source community also is a place to influence the CEDS data elements. If you want to add them to the kind of repository that already exists as a member of this community, you can do that and ensure that everything is up to date, current, and relevant. And I think we had a person with their hand up, so I'm going to stop and see if that person wants to unmute and share their question. If not, then I am going to turn it back over, I believe, to Darren.
Thank you, Rachel. DJ, I just want you to know that I believe you were the one with your hand up. You should be able to come off mute now. So wanted to give you the opportunity before we dived into the next portion.
I am good. Thank you, though, for the opportunity. It was touched later on, so I'm good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Understood. Absolutely. Okay, well, thank you. I will take control of the slides now, Rachel. Thank you again. Okay, so now we are going to move into the round robin portion of our presentation. So thank you again, everybody, for joining this webinar. My name is Darren Wright. I'm a CEDTA provider. I will be serving as moderator for this state-driven discussion surrounding CEDS. We will hear from states regarding their experiences, initiating the work of mapping data in CEDS, maintaining their CEDS processes, and finally leveraging the CEDS open source community. So to all in attendance, just want to invite you to drop comments or questions in the chat in response to any of the topics or components of discussion that we will cover here, and we'll plan to address them at the end, time permitting. And I see a lot of the state panelists here have joined us. Thank you all again for joining. So without further ado, let's meet our state panelists. And panelists, if you could please, upon hearing your name, come off mute, introduce yourself, and provide your state and your title within your agency. That would be fantastic. So first up, I'll turn it over to Charlotte Zeller.
Hi, I'm Charlotte Zeller from Kansas, and I'm our Data Compliance Officer.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Next up, Deborah Donovan.
Hi, I'm Deborah Donovan. I'm the Director of Data Analysis and Reporting at the Mississippi Department of Education.
Thank you, Deborah. And finally, Richard Madison.
Richard Madison. I'm an Information Systems Manager at the State of Kansas Department of Education.
Fantastic. Well, welcome to you all, and thank you again for joining us today for this discussion. So let's dive right in. We'll begin with the topic of CEDS mapping. Give me one moment. Let's stop sharing, get our little Brady Bunch squares going here instead of looking at the slides. There we go. Okay, so as I'm sure, so on the topic of CEDS data mapping, so as I'm sure many of us have likely experienced firsthand, mapping projects can vary, whether in terms of timeline or complexity, and depending, of course, on scope. There are a number of tools at state's disposal to progress this work. So before we dive too deep into CEDS mapping and looking at my squares here, the Hollywood squares in front of me, Deborah, I'll open the virtual floor up to you first. What were some of the primary resources you used to accomplish your initial CEDS mapping?
Thanks. So our initial CEDS mapping took place several years ago, actually, and at that time we used a lot of the resources available on the website, on the CEDS website. And we also had some support from the CEDS staff, as we just kind of dove right into it ourselves and, attempted to create all of our mappings and then asked for some feedback and review from that staff. The website is probably the #1 resource that I use. We're going through a modernization project where we're doing additional mapping, so it's pulled up in my browser all the time.
That's great. Thank you, Deborah. Richard, I'll pass it to you.
Kansas actually started doing CEDS mapping about 10 years ago. Actually had to go back and check because it had been so long since we had started. However, the progress that we've made did not extend out past our main data collection system. And so as we've mapped over the years, we've made use of various tools that were provided on the CEDS website or through the CID support team to do mapping such as the workbooks or the more recently, the ETL checklists for Generate, which serve the purpose for Generate and also for just data mapping in general to CEDS.
That's great. Thank you both. Yeah, and I want to, Charlotte, I want to give you a chance too, if you wanted to add anything to Richard's piece.
Nope. Richard's got it
Okay.
under control. I told him earlier that he was the brains and the handsome one. So there we go.
Okay, well, thank you, Charlotte, and thank you, Deborah and Richard, for that. And when we think of resources, now that we've briefly touched upon like your resources, one thing that I noticed that the kind of the converge point between the two of your answers was just the fact that there is support available outside of tools that you could access virtually on resources, like actual people that you can talk to. Some people in states may not always be aware of that. We talked about some of the data governance principles earlier. One of the key considerations being communication. That includes communication of what's available to all of us. So like that was a good, I like that converge point you both came to there. So now that we've talked about resources, wanted to take a moment to talk about challenges and how they may be addressed. So thinking of challenges, what were the major hurdles that you initially encountered or identified during this initial mapping process that you each detailed? And Kansas, I'll kick that one back to you to begin us.
Since again, we're going back pretty far on the initial mapping, I'll let Charlotte do the next couple. We actually had trouble expanding due to a combination of issues with getting buy-in from people to understand why it was worth the effort. And also we had a very large amount of data that needed to be mapped. So incorporating it into the workflow was just very, very difficult. So we focused on the things that were consistent over time. And then we were not able to overcome a lot of hurdles for the expanded data set that wasn't necessarily reported directly for federal reports or had some kind of a benefit that was immediately obvious. So that was one of our major hurdles, was buy-in for less obvious mapping benefits.
Great, thank you. Deborah, pass it on to you.
Sure. So one of our major issues was identifying where the true source of our data elements were. Like, for example, we know items that we report in the child count. But let's say, one of the elements is race and ethnicity in the child count. Well, in our system, we have that stored in a child count table. But when we really tried to say like, okay, but we know it doesn't start there. So where is the first time or the original place that we collect that information, and where does it come from? And, trying not to eliminate all the duplication that we had across our system. Like we tend to just copy data, to be most convenient and carry it around with the records that we needed, which is maybe not the best plan when then you look at your database and it has grown to a monstrosity in size and elements. And when you try to do something automated mapping, you've got race and ethnicity listed 200 times in your database. So trying to just figure out where the original source of that data came from was a challenge, and narrowing all of that down. And then coming across data elements that we really didn't know what they were. We know there's a word for them, they have a title and maybe a very small definition, but over time we've lost documentation and knowledge of, probably the person that first requested that element to be added. And nobody really knew, asking around in our data governance, it's like, hey, is anybody using this? Does anybody know why we're collecting it, how we're reporting on it? So it's a little orphan element.
Yes, absolutely. All great points. And, you each kind of addressed it, at least to some extent, but that the byproduct of a lot of these challenges is that they create a risk of, potentially a single point of failure within SEAs. So Deborah, you kind of touched on it touched on it there, like those seasoned veterans that you have within your states who develop so much institutional knowledge, and, perhaps more knowledge than we realize of that is in their heads, not documented anywhere. Not reflected in any of the shared workflow processes that Richard touched upon, but yeah, all good stuff. Thank you. So I'd like to stay on challenges just for a moment, but kind of broaden our lens a bit to discuss obstacles that you all have encountered related to sustainability. So Deborah, I think we'll start back with you. So wanted to know, what challenges have you seen to sustainability of your integrated data systems? There may be some overlap here, and whether these are specific to CEDS or not, please feel free to share.
Yeah. So I would say it's really within our data governance effort, trying to mature that. I would say we are on our way to being, hopefully a mature data governance committee in our state. But just like I was just talking about those orphaned data elements, sometimes there's not a clear data owner for elements, especially when you're talking about like who owns the school name, element. It's not something that's as clear as, a child's disability. Obviously, our special education data steward, will come to plate for that one. But some of those other ones we've really had trouble, people thinking like, I'm not responsible for that. I don't, I don't think, I should, be the data owner for that. Um, and, along that same line of thought, like people just addressing data as an afterthought, right? And I'm not saying data should be the first thing people think of, right? Policy drives data collections, and initiatives drive data collections, but we just kind of keep nudging and reminding for people to think about data, as they're implementing, as they're creating those policies and initiatives, to think about how you're going to measure the outcomes, something you're planning, and be thoughtful about, does that mean we need to collect something differently or report something differently on the front end? And just, trying to keep track of all of the differences and, mutations maybe in definitions. Sometimes the state definition starts to veer away from the federal definition. So that can be challenging sometimes.
Great, thank you, Deborah. Kansas.
This is where we really have been very similar with Mississippi. I mean, overall, that we have a lot of similarities, but we've also had challenges with the differences in state and federal. When you're looking at that, and we have one thing, but the federal definition is totally different. That's always a challenge. It's rewarding when you can resolve it and work through it, but it's a challenge to get there. And then the other part of what's been a challenge for us is our master data management hasn't been consistently implemented. So, anytime you have changes in personnel or how we're doing things or in our data governance, that impacts everything. And so it's always like there's a recovery portion.
Absolutely. Well said, all. As I heard some of those responses, my mind went back to some of those key principles surrounding data governance that Rachel covered, particularly data quality and timeliness. I always find it helpful to see the overlap and the shared challenges. Specifically, it lets us know we're not all alone in this process, and that presents opportunities for more cross-state collaboration that is a pillar in this work. I think we would all agree. But great, thank you so much for those contributions. Now that we've kind of set the scene with challenges of sustainability, let's talk approaches to addressing such challenges. So what techniques or strategies have you implemented within your agency to ensure long-term success in submitting quality data into your integrated systems? And additionally, what does success in this regard mean to your state? Since success can be defined in a bunch of different ways, and as I'm sure it is across states. So Kansas, I'll open the floor back up to you.
We have a pretty structured training program for actual data entry users. We did data quality certification. It's DQC. I think C is certification, but it's for data quality. We make documentation easily accessible, posted on our website. That's maintained, updated each year for our different data collections. We have a lot of data validation tools and review tools for collecting the data and for our internal processes to manage the data as it works through our different systems. None of which are perfect, but again, we do have an extensive amount of it that is our goal is to improve that data quality. And really when it comes down to, it's hard to say that success is something in a way that's measurable, but success is a situation where you're able to be confident that the data you're collecting is accurate, reliable, and timely, and that you're able to report it or use that data to inform policy in the least least difficult way possible. So we acknowledge, there's no perfect thing, but there is something where it's a lot easier to work with. It's a lot more reliable. And honestly, our goal is just to continually strive to improve those things.
Great, thank you, Richard. Deborah, turn it over to you.
Yeah, so as they mentioned earlier, master data management, or creating that knowledge-based business glossary of data dictionary, whatever you want to call it, within our state has been something that we're striving towards, and that comes as part of the data governance maturity process, trying to move that along. And really, it's the process is almost as meaningful as the outcome there, right? Like getting people to look at their data and talk about it and try to describe it, and get really makes them think about their data and what they're collecting. So that also builds confidence within our data owners and our data stewards, that they do feel empowered and they do feel responsible for their data areas. We've done a lot in preparation for the system modernization that we're doing on. We spent, over a year solely concentrating on process improvement. So we identified 9 different key process areas within our agency that we wanted to focus on, anywhere from like data reporting to customer support, stakeholder engagement, to infrastructure, all the different areas where data intersects. To kind of evaluate where we currently are and what kind of what kind of tools and processes we needed to have in place to support a new modernized system. So we really did a whole evaluation of ourselves and identified some plans to get us there. That included, we have like a dedicated stakeholder engagement position and a dedicated process improvement position. So, it's kind of like, I'm in the tech world, I'm in IT, so it's like getting a little bit out of your comfort space, and talking about people and relationships and, what that means for data.
Well said, Deborah and Richard. What we're talking about here, data systems, obviously a technical endeavor, but I'm not a technical person, but I like to consider myself more of a process and people person. And, oftentimes that is the hardest part. The zeros and the ones, they can come, and I see, heads nodding on the screen, which is validating for me. Yeah, the zeros and ones, they will come, the work will get done. We all have our heads down. The people and processes sometimes can be, one of the strongest hurdles. And I love what you said, Deborah, about empowering the data stewards that are, within your agencies to have a little bit more confidence, a little bit more ownership. That leads us back to our earlier conversation regarding sustainability, right? When you're talking about the key components of sustainability, ownership and comfortability in your work and the data that you're providing, the data that you're looking at, even just being able to go in and look at that data and having the confidence when you're doing so to ask the right questions, can make the world of difference. So thank you all for that. And the final piece we're going to talk about is the CEDS open source community. But before we do that, having just talked about the people piece of it, while it's still fresh in our minds. So regarding success in your states, and we'll start with Deborah, what key roles have been most critical to ensure the continued success of your processes?
Yeah. So as I just mentioned or described, we did identify those key process areas, KPA areas within, and we had 9 of those, and each one of those had a lead. So there's like one person in the agency who's dedicated to moving that area forward, and making improvements there. So having dedicated people for those areas was important. And also leadership, both, within IT and data governance, but also I feel like really lucky that even all the way up to our state board of education values data. We have 6 goals in our state board of education plan, and data systems is one of those goals. So, I feel really lucky that that's a priority in our state, and that just, it trickles down, right? So that's really beneficial.
Great, thank you so much, Deborah. Turn it over to Kansas.
For us, it's truly our IT director. She is our biggest advocate as far as, working with the rest of the agency, getting them on board to understand the importance of the data, of what we're collecting, what we're doing, why it's important to be CEDS compliant, all these components that go through it. We have our data governance board, but it's a continual education of learning to share with them, because nothing stays the same for very long. And so we're continually educating everyone in the agency, and our director is our biggest supporter and proponent, and she's touching all those different levels of leadership all the time. So we really couldn't be doing this without her assistance. And so, yeah, she has been our most critical link to how we're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. That recurring theme of leadership buy-in, right? It's been mentioned time and time again, and certainly many times in this conversation. So thank you all for those valuable insights. So moving on, last but certainly not least, is our discussion about the CEDS open source community. So we heard from Rachel just a bit earlier before this session kicked off regarding why states want to be active or would want to be active in the open source community as it relates to EDFACS modernization. So let's dig in a bit to this community. So we'll start with Kansas. What does your commitment look like to the open source community in your state, or what might you expect it to look like down the road?
Well, it'll be down the road, and it's something that we're definitely looking forward to. However, at the time that we were able to kind of start expanding our CEDS mapping and starting to move towards a more connected process that would easily be able to work with the CEDS open source community, we also decided to go ahead and redo our entire system into a CEDS compliant database, which is a multi-year project, but trying to map the current data to that to take advantage of it at this point in time was a little bit too early, but we are in the process to have the new system up and running next year as part of a pilot program, which would then allow us to start working with the open source community. So it is, unfortunately, it's not there yet, but we are looking forward to it next school year to participate in it. We've definitely had many discussions with it and had many very well managed meetings that have been hosted by CID that show the benefits of it, show all the ways that it can be connected. We're very much looking forward to doing that. We know how we're going to do it as soon as we have that up and running, but we haven't been able to take advantage of it because it would have gotten in the way of accomplishing the work to get all the way there. So unfortunately, we don't have much beyond that other than we are really looking forward to it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rupert. That's fantastic though, right? Like knowing where you're at, identifying those pieces and making sure that you're prepared for when the effort kicks off. I mean, there's a lot of value in that. So appreciate you sharing. Deborah, pass it over to you.
So we are also building a new system. We're in the thick of it now, and our system is totally based off of CEDS. We're trying to collect data in CEDS format and have as few transformations or changes to that data as possible, all the way out to reporting, which obviously ties in with our generate work with CID. Could be making a really big push forward on generate over the next couple of years. So we've been in lots of conversations. Once you start building a system, and lots of things start popping up that you need feedback on or insight on, like, oh, how are we going to do this? How does that look in CEDS, and what matches? So we've been participating in the community a lot, and then we also have made a big promise, I guess, to ourselves that we will share everything that we develop that can benefit the CEDS community at large. Since we are building a system that is based on CEDS, hopefully, things that we develop, reporting, and other solutions can be shared with others.
That's great. Thank you, Deborah. Yeah, the key to the work, right? Sharing, sharing everything that we're working on so that we can all benefit from it. Love it. And, you know, Deborah, given Mississippi's level of involvement in the CEDS open source community, you just kind of laid out there. And Kansas, please feel free to chime in at any point. I know you just kind of laid out your roadmap, but with these last two questions, wanted to ask you about the contributions to the open source community. Any contributions that you've made that you'd like to highlight, Deborah?
Yeah, so, you know, like many other states who, like, once you start developing something, you start, you know, realizing that there's, you know, something that may be a benefit to other states. So we've started entering in, you know, what they call tickets, to the open source community to say, like, you know what, we collect, we have one out there right now for board members. You know, like school district board members, you know, like that's something that Mississippi collects. And it's probably not unique to Mississippi. You know, that's probably something that lots of, you know, states and districts, you know, have information about or would like to collect. So it's something that we'll bring to the community to say, you know, instead of making that a Mississippi specific extension or addition to our data system, let's see, you know, if the whole community could benefit from that. And then also because we are building this CEDS-based data collection, that means we're building what we call schemas or, you know, file specifications for school districts to transfer their data to us. And that's also something that we really thought there would be a great benefit amongst the community. So we've actually started a work group with some other states. It's called the CEDS JSON XML schema work group. It's pretty technical in there. Sometimes I even get, you know, over my head with the conversation, but it is open for anyone to participate in, listen in, and join in.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Deborah. Looking at the, I do not see any questions coming in yet. So we have one, but we have one final question on our end. And we covered this again. Rachel briefly mentioned it about the benefits of participating in the open source community as referred or regarding FX modernization. But, you know, Deborah, again, given your Mississippi's involvement, you know, any benefits that you could identify in participating in the open source community that you'd like to share?
Yeah. So I'm not shy about our problems because if we have a problem, it's probably a problem for you all too. So we're really open with sharing, like, here's our challenges. And if we've solved it, great. We'll tell you all about that too and how we overcame them. But we might also be soliciting some ideas from other people who maybe that you've already solved that problem. And it's also just about building consensus, right? Like, you don't want to feel like you're out in left field, you know, in a silo, right? We use that term a lot with data, you know, developing a system. Like, we want to make sure, like, here's what we're thinking, you know, help present that in the open source community with other states, and, you know, help, you know, be our thought partners, and review things that we've developed, and, you know, to kind of validate that, yeah, like we're using CEDS thoughtfully and, you know, the way it was intended, and something that could be a benefit to everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much, Deborah. And, you know, I can't echo that enough about how much I know that we see CID appreciate that sharing of lessons learned. Again, you know, I feel like a broken record, but just it's so valuable in getting that cross-state collaboration, identifying an issue. And again, as Deborah said, likely you're not the only ones experiencing it. So that's always good to hear that, you know, those opportunities are there and that work group sounds like it's doing great stuff. So again, thank you so much for sharing. I am going to pivot to the chat just for a moment. Okay, I don't see any questions, but do want to invite anybody to, if they do have a question, to drop it in. We are doing good on time. We're right on schedule, which I love. So going to give it a moment, brief pause. Well, I'm not seeing anything come in, but should you have a question, you know, after this, maybe after you've had time to absorb the discussion that we've just had, please feel free to reach out to any of us, reach out to CID-TA, and we'd be happy to connect you with the right people. But, you know, with that, we're going to go ahead and conclude the round robin for today. A huge thank you once more to our states for their, you know, meaningful contributions. Richard, Deborah, Charlotte, it was great to get the opportunity to speak to you all. You know, this conversation, again, as well as the presentation that preceded it, will of course it's being recorded, will be posted to CEDS website so you can consume it later at your leisure. And before we break today, I'm going to pass it back over to Sarah Sinani, who's gonna take us out.
Thanks, Darren. Do you mind sharing the PowerPoint again?
Absolutely.
I'm going to pop it into the chat, but you'll also see up on the presentation a link to our evaluation. We really appreciate all the feedback that we get from these evaluations. It helps us tailor our TA to the needs of the state and how we present things. I want to also take time to thank Rachel for the information that she presented to us on data governance and modernization. And a huge, again, special thank you to our state participants. It was really great to hear how you all are handling CEDS in your state and how you're planning for sustainability of both CEDS, but also your integrated data systems and generate and modernization as we go forward. So a huge thank you to all. And as always, if you have questions for us, feel free to email CIDTA. But we would really appreciate it if you filled out those webinars. And with that, we will see you next time, and we'll give you 4 minutes back in your day. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, all. Have a great Friday.